Okay, do you ever wonder if your villain has to be a tangible person or can just be more of a force? Especially in the fantasy world, there's a lot of debate about this. And this is something my critique group and I recently discussed, and I literally went, and there's my next podcast. So what do you think? If you write villains at all, then keep listening because you might hear something interesting here. Stay tuned. Hi there, aspiring fiction author. Welcome to Fiction Author Business School. Do you want to write your stories with ease and confidence? Do you find yourself Googling how to write a fiction book or how to write a character arc? Do you want to create a fiction empire, but you can't even finish the story you're currently working on, and you find yourself doubting it will even be good enough? Hi, I'm Liesel. I too have been writing stories since I was just a kid. I wanted to do something about my fiction writing dreams, but got information overload every time I looked for writing help because there's just so much out there on the internet. I wanted confidence that I wouldn't disappoint my readers and a plan to publish regularly. I knew the foundation of any author career, including the marketing aspect, is a stellar and well-written story, but I didn't know how to be sure that my story was solid. I went on a journey to figure out what really makes readers tick and how to incorporate those addictive elements into my story. In this podcast, you'll find specific, tactical fiction writing tips, solutions to writing more words more efficiently, and secrets to mastering your author mindset. So, put on your fuzzy slippers, grab a notebook and pen and some chocolate, and let's write some fiction. Introduction. Okay, so I remember years ago going to a writing conference and hearing Maxwell Alexander Drake, who is a very successful fantasy author, lecture on villains. Now, I've never read any of Drake's books, but as I said, he's very successful, and I have no doubt that he's a really awesome writer. But I really loved listening to him lecture. You know, he was really funny and really interesting, and I just enjoyed listening to him speak a lot. But one thing he has a real pet peeve about is that your villain should be a tangible, sentient being who plays a big part in the story. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, duh, why wouldn't the villain be that, right? Maybe it seems obvious. Well, especially in fantasy, the villain sometimes can be kind of nebulous, okay? They can be more of a force rather than an actual person. Drake even had some really negative things to say about Sauron. He calls him the big, stupid, ugly red eye rather than a person. His words, not mine. But truly, that didn't ever bother me, right? And Drake had a lot to say hate-wise about Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, because in that series, the biggest baddie of them all, the Dark One, is pretty nebulous that way. And, you know, if you haven't heard me say this before, The Wheel of Time is pretty much my favorite series of all time. So you can see why I might immediately rebel against this idea. You know, I remember listening to him and I was kind of laughing at his jokes. And even though I enjoyed his lecture, I was kind of thinking in my head, nah, dude, you're crazy. You know, I don't agree with that. But as time went on, and as I got more into the psychology and the energetics of writing, I didn't want to just rebel against that idea because one of my favorite series has it. You know, I wanted to know why it didn't bother me, right? Because truly, having a nebulous bad guy in more than one of my favorite fantasy series of all time never bothered me. That was never an issue for me, but I didn't really know why. I just knew that it didn't, right? So, is having a very physical, tangible, sentient bad guy probably better for your story, especially in terms of readers being able to really latch on to them? Yeah, probably. Okay, I'm not disagreeing that having a very tangible villain is probably the best route in most cases. But if that's the case, then why was I perfectly okay with stories that didn't have that? Trust me, it's not because I couldn't figure out who the villain was, or I couldn't latch onto them. I mean, that definitely wasn't the case in those stories. But that's exactly my point, and the answer to my question about why it didn't bother me. See, most people, including Mr. Drake, who I have nothing but the utmost respect for, are assuming, via that argument, that any character, not just the villain, but any character, though this does tend to happen specifically with villains rather than protagonists, but they assume that, say, a villain's tangibility is what makes him a villain, what makes him memorable, and maybe even what defines their function in the story. And I'm here to tell you that's actually not the case. think about it this way. I'm going to use one of my famous baking analogies here. I don't remember if I've told this story specifically on the podcast before, but when I was really young, I was learning to bake. So I was probably like 8 or 9. And I actually knew my way around a cookbook by then because I did a lot of baking growing up. But I was still learning, and I would still kind of screw up the recipe sometimes just because I was still learning. And I was making chocolate chip cookies, and I was basically done. I had put in all the ingredients and done everything I was supposed to do, and I could tell there was something wrong with the dough. It was not coming together the way cookie dough should. It was very crumbly. So my mom came in and started, ticking off ingredients on her hands. Did you put in the butter? Did you put in the flour? Did you put in the sugar? And when she got to eggs, I almost said yes, and then I stopped and went, oh, that's it. I forgot the eggs. So I went to the fridge and got the eggs and put them in. And certainly, the eggs are a binder. It did bring the dough together because I put them in at the wrong time. It was not perfect cookie dough. It actually ended up being very cake-like. But, it worked out. It still tasted okay. We made the cookies. We had lots of kids growing up. So trust me, cookies got eaten if they tasted good. It didn't really matter what the consistency was. But why am I telling you that? Because I want you to think of it this way. When you eat a chocolate chip cookie, you really don't think you're eating an egg, right? It doesn't look like an egg, it doesn't smell like an egg, doesn't have the texture of any kind of egg. And sure, most of us probably intuitively, or because we've know something about baking, we know that there's eggs in cookies. So we know that we're eating eggs among other things. But if you didn't know that, if you were just looking at it based on what you can observe in the finished product of the cookie, you would have no idea there were eggs in there, right? It doesn't look like eggs at all. So if you were to give a cookie to someone who truly knew nothing about baking, they wouldn't know that there were eggs in a cookie. So it's kind of the same thing here. The reason that any given element of writing, so whether it's your villain or your world building or your protagonist, any element, whether it works or doesn't work is actually because of the invisible elements of the story. It has nothing to do with what we can actually see of the villain. And believe it or not, it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with what he does or what he says. Or she, sorry. I tend to default to he when it comes to villain, but he or she, whoever your villain is. You can have a villain, let's put it this way, and this is kind of the ultimate thing that proves that it doesn't really matter whether they're sentient and tangible or not, because there are plenty of stories out there that do have a sentient, tangible being as their villain, and either the story sucks or the villain sucks. So obviously that is not the end-all be-all for writing a great villain. On the other hand, you have stories like The Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings that really, really resonate with people. And, years and years and years after they're written, hordes of people are still reading them and loving them. Clearly, something was done right there, and just because they don't have a sentient being for the villain, or in other words, because the villain's a little more nebulous, didn't mean that the story wasn't successful. Okay, so that really should be your main piece of evidence right there that this argument isn't really very sound. Okay, so the elements, the invisible elements, are just a lot deeper than what we see or what we hear the villain say. It's about understanding these invisible elements, understanding the psychology of the character journey, hitting all 3 levels of emotion of your story, and doing that intentionally, okay? That is what makes the whole story come together in a pleasing way and work. Very much like our chocolate chip cookie. If we don't get all the ingredients in, it's not going to work. The dough is not going to come together. It's not going to bake right. And like I said, even though I was able to put that in and kind of salvage it, it was not the best. It would be the equivalent of a somewhat mediocre, unfocused story because I waited too long to put the eggs in, so the texture wasn't quite right. It was a little screwy, right? And it was still okay. But remember that stories can be okay and sell some books, but they're never going to be as successful as you want them to be if, everything is not coming together really well the way that it's supposed to. So, to be more specific, when it comes to the villain, I guess the next question is then, what do we need to do to make sure that whether our villain is nebulous and a force or whether they're a more tangible being, what do we need to do to make that villain really, really successful in the story, right? Well, I guess the 10,000 foot view is that we need to feel the villain's presence. And here's where the argument about the villain needing to be tangible, again, becomes maybe even a little bit silly to me, okay? Using story psychology and the character journey, I can tell you that you need to feel the villain's presence pretty much right away in the story, like first act, maybe even first chapter, first scene. But I can also tell you that actually putting the villain on the page that early is going to be a mistake. Like anyone who's ever studied storycraft, you know that you don't put the villain on the first page usually. Possibly if there's a prologue, but not in the opening chapter. That's not what the opening chapter is for. So you have to make the villain's presence known in other ways, through the conflict that you, the author, know that the villain is at the core of, right? Even if your characters and your readers don't know that. So a lot of times in the opening scene, we might see something like some of the villain's thugs, or we're showing a negative side effect of what the villain is doing. I mean, there's plenty of ways to do this, but I want you to think about what I just said. Really think about it. There are times, such as in the first chapter or the opening act, right, where the villain's presence needs to be felt without the villain actually being present, okay? Independent of this argument about whether the villain should be tangible or not, that's the case in Storycraft. And if that's the case, doesn't that kind of prove that we don't need a super tangible villain? Now, I'm going to give you the things that you kind of must have in your story where the villain is concerned. And I will say that having a tangible villain will work best and be easiest for these things, okay? Again, I'm really not arguing that. I'm just saying that if you know what you're doing, it's not absolutely necessary to have a tangible villain. Especially when you're starting out, when you're writing your first few books, I definitely would. Because keeping track of a villain's presence without him or her actually being a physical character is a little bit tricky. And you have to keep more things in your head and you have to balance more things. So it's not something that I would recommend, especially for first-time authors. But again, once you become more skilled and kind of know what you need to have in the story to bring the villain out and to, you know, make the story work, then you can play with things a little bit more. And again, I just think it's a little bit silly to bash stories that have a more nebulous villain, especially when they're super, super successful in the eyes of the readers or in the eyes of the audience, okay? So again, I go back to the why didn't a nebulous villain bother me? Because the author helped me, the reader, feel the presence of the villain in ways that are effective and necessary to the story. Okay, it was always totally clear who the villain was, what he or she was, what they were planning, and why they were important. Okay, so let's go over each of those. We need to know who the villain is. That much should be clear and obvious. You need to have an opposing force to your protagonist, whether it's a person or a force, right, in your story. So clearly, we need to know who the antagonistic person or force is. Next, we need to know why they're important to the story and the character. In other words, we need to know their motivations and probably their backstory. Notice that even in those more nebulous beings, you know, maybe we should stick with Sauron because most people know him, we do know the backstory of Sauron. They tell us right up front about these battles and things that happened in the past. And if you read the series, the books, there are entire indexes and appendices about the histories of Middle-earth, right? So we know who the villain is, and we know what his motivations and backstory are. The third thing we need to know is what they're doing. At some point, their evil plan has to become clear. And that's true of any story, guys. I mean, of course, the characters may spend the majority of the book not knowing what the evil plan is or trying to figure it out, but at some point, you have to reveal the villain's master plan, their evil plan, to the reader, okay? And once we understand that, that also helps us understand the villain a little bit more. And finally, we have to know what he is. In other words, what form he or she takes. There must be a physical representation of some kind. It doesn't have to be the actual villain, but something that the characters can observe with their five senses. So this can be in the form of a minion of the villain. I'll give you some examples in just a minute. A result or byproduct of them directly, or a result of something they have done or are doing. So you might say, if there needs to be a physical representation, doesn't it follow that the villain should be physical? Yes and no. I mean, I suppose you could argue that. It really just depends on how you want to look at it. Let's look at 3 examples, and then you'll kind of understand what I mean in terms of a physical representation. So, I mean, again, the most obvious example that I think people are familiar with is Lord of the Rings. Even though we don't really see Sauron all that much as a person, we have orcs, we have goblins, we have people who are doing his bidding. So there are physical representations of him and his plan, even though we don't actually see him. And I think it's important for you to have something for the characters to focus on that is more physical, again, that they can observe with their five senses. So if you want to argue that, yes, maybe the villain does need to be physical because obviously the characters need this physical representation to focus on, okay, I understand that argument. But again, I'm just making this argument against people who say the villain is stupid because he's nebulous. In these stories, like Lord of the Rings, the villain is pretty nebulous, but that doesn't make the story not work, right? The author has just gone about it a different way. And it's actually very similar with The Wheel of Time. That was the second example I was going to use. In that case, the villain, or at least the overarching villain, is probably more nebulous than Sauron is, all right? But we still see people speaking with him. And there are so many villains, like smaller villains, bigger villains, sub-villains, villains for each and every character that they're up against, that we never, and there's more to my point of the things that I said you needed, they are all connected to the bigger villain through this massive overarching plan. So again, it doesn't keep the story from working that we don't have a really physical representation of the arch villain, right? It works really well, actually. Another example that my friend McKellar reminded me of is The Neverending Story. That's a movie I grew up watching. In fact, it's one of about 3 or 4 reasons I think that I love fantasy. In that, if you've ever seen it, it's an old movie from the 80s. You watch it now, it's kind of cheesy, but still a really good story. It's just 80s acting and 80s, if you can call it CGI. It's really not CGI, 80s special effects, you know. Anyway, the villain in that is literally called the Nothing, and it's a force, almost like a tornado or something. Okay, I will say that there is another villain in the form of a wolf type animal, but it's also true that he's not the overarching villain. So once again, we have the more nebulous villain, and then we have a minion of that villain, which is what the Gamork is. And so we do have the physical representation that the character can focus on, but the arch villain is very nebulous. So you see what I mean? If you want to call it, okay, well then maybe the villain needs to be tangible. I do understand that argument, and okay, it just kind of depends on how you want to look at it and how you want to explain it. But if you want to have a more nebulous villain because that serves your story better, I think you can do that. You just need to make sure that you have all of these things nailed down, as in who the villain is, backstory, motivations, what they're doing, why they're doing it. And then you do have to have some form of physical manifestation in the story that the characters can focus on. Okay. So I hope that, helps you see what I mean. I think that the villains worked very well in each of those 3 stories that I mentioned because we understood what they were doing and what it meant for the characters and the story. Okay. It's not like anyone reads or watches Lord of the Rings and goes, wait, who's Sauron? I mean, of course we know who he is. We know very well who he is, what he's doing, why he's important, because the author has communicated it to us very, very well throughout the story. So I guess that's really my underlying point. If you can communicate those things about the villain, it doesn't really matter what form he's in. We just need to feel his presence in the story and understand what it means for the protagonist, right? If you can bring those things across successfully, plus communicate maybe through the mood and the ambience of the story that the villain is, evil, not desirable. It just depends on what kind of story you're writing. It's not going to matter how tangible or how nebulous he is. His or her presence and influence will still be felt in the story in a way that helps the reader understand the story and experience the story. Okay, they need to experience the villain, the way that it feels, right? The emotions that the villain makes the protagonist feel, the reader needs to experience those. And my argument here is that the villain doesn't have to be super tangible for that to happen. They're going to feel the villain as they read the story more than anything else anyway. They're going to feel his presence, his evil plan, the things that he makes the protagonist feel, assuming that you have that all nailed down in your story. And let's face it, guys, these 3 examples that I gave you, they're 3 uber successful stories. So authors and academia can wax as philosophical as we want about what is and isn't correct in fiction. But we all know at the end of the day, it's the readers who buy it and gush about it, or don't, who are the ultimate authorities on whether the story was successful or not. Okay, so either the readers love it or they don't. And in these 3 stories, at least, where the villain is very nebulous, the audience loves those stories. That's why they're so successful. But the other real reason that an intangible villain can work is because the invisible elements are often more powerful than the tangible elements. Tangible elements can lie, they can be misleading, they can be downright deceptive, but feelings and energies can't be. They're always truthful. And in a lot of ways, an intangible villain is almost easier to feel than a tangible one. Sometimes. It just depends on, how you're writing it and everything. So look, in terms of the invisible elements, whether you're religious or not, spiritual or not, woo-woo or not, we all know that there are forces out there we can feel that we can't quantify with our five senses. For example, emotion, right? We feel those, but we can't see them or touch them or hear them, right? And that, more than anything else, is what we're trying to help our readers feel through our stories, is the emotions. We get their attention, we build emotion through our story, and then we give them a catharsis or a release near the end. So I guess if you want to distill everything I've said here down into a nutshell, it's that if the reader feels the emotions of the story, and you have to have an effective villain or antagonist in order to do that, otherwise you do not have an effective story, they will not feel the emotion of it, then it doesn't really matter what form the villain takes. The reader still feels and understands them. So remember back at the beginning, I said it didn't bug me that these villains in these stories were kind of nebulous and I didn't know why. It's because I could still feel the emotion of the story. It was still a very effective story. And, I'm just saying, define an effective story. It's one that makes us feel the emotion, right? So it's not about how tangible or how nebulous your villain is. It's not about whether it's a he or she, whether it's a human or some other creature. It's about whether the villain is effective in the story at bringing the emotion across. Okay. But if you do want the logical steps, for what you need to include, they are what I said above. We need to know who the villain is, just to recap. We need to know what he is, what his plan is. And again, I keep saying he, but he, she, it, whatever it is. And we need to know why he or she is important to the story and the characters. Okay. We need to feel their ambiance through the story. We need to feel the emotion of what they're doing to the main character. And if you can do that, I'm going to argue that you can have as nebulous a villain as you want, and your readers will still love you for it. Okay? That is what I have for you guys today. Just something to chew on and think about your villain a little bit. Thanks so much for listening. Oh, if you haven't yet, remember to join my Facebook group. I will put the link in the show notes. I just recently put a post in there that I'm going to pin to the top that is a poll about what training you guys would like. I'm going to do probably a workshop sometime in the next few weeks. And if you want to get in on the poll and vote for what you would like me to teach on, make sure and get in there and vote because I'm only going to leave the voting open for another few days, okay? Go out there and craft those crafty villains. And if you can bring them across effectively, your readers will always love them. All right? We'll talk soon. Bye. Thanks so much for listening today. Before you go, would you be willing to do me a solid? If you found any value at all in this episode today, would you be willing to share it with other authors just like you in the hopes that they might find some value in it as well? Happy story crafting this week. Remember, only you can bring the world the unique story that you are trying to tell. Only you can succeed in your own unique way in getting it out of your mind and your heart and into a medium where it can reach thousands, if not millions, of salivating readers. You don't have to worry about failure because there is always a market for awesome.